And recording. The time is 6:03 p.m. This is August 9th, 2018. This is the scheduled meeting of ITSC 2309. And let's see, we need to talk briefly here about the system catalogs, and I'm going to go okay. Modules, okay. Let me go to the one I left you with. I told you I was going to talk more about the system catalogs. So, okay, in other words, under views now, views, view assignment. It's pretty simple. And then we get to the last one, and it says write a select statement that selects all of the column from the catalog view that returns information about foreign keys and how many keys are defined. Change that right. Are defined DIF and ED in the AP database. And this one is really fairly simple. If you will look on page 404, 405 of the textbook, it discusses the catalog views. And it talks about quite a few of them, and one of them is sys.foreign keys. If we talk about sys.foreign keys, all this is asking you to do really, when it says write a select, it selects all of the catalog from the view that returns information about foreign keys. This is really this simple: select splat from sys underscore foreign keys. And if we look at that, this gives us information about the foreign key constraints. This is really under this view right here is under a larger view that is called sys underscore key constraints. But under foreign keys, I can find out the name of the foreign key, the name it's given. This is why we always name them. If we don't name them, by the way, they're given a constraint. We have its object ID. Remember, we've talked about the object ID if object ID is not null. And so this is the primary key of this guy is the object ID. Schema ID. Most of this stuff is really coming later. We can see the date it was created, the date it was modified. We see its name and a lot of information about it. What happens if we delete the key it's referencing and all that stuff. But right now we're just saying select everything from sys.foreign keys. So how would we get how many foreign keys are there? How would we get that? Well, we're just going to select a count from sys foreign keys. So to get the number of foreign keys that there are, I just count them. How many am I expecting? 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm expecting to see 5. There are a total of 5 foreign keys. But if we say I want to select all information about it, I say just show me all of the information about foreign keys. And it is that easy. I said it was easy. It's simple. There's kind of an iceberg here. What exactly is sys.foreign keys? I've got quite a few of these guys. For example, I can find out information about tables. So if I select from sys.tables, I can find out all of the information about the various tables. So I find out its name, let's see, I find out its object ID, I find out what is it, its type description is a user table. What's important here? Number of columns. I can look through this guy and get all kinds of information about it. The main thing is right now that these guys are views that are based on the system catalog. So if we look at the tables that we talk about in this guy, we're talking about page 404 and 405. And we talk about the tables, the views, the columns, the key constraints, and this one, foreign keys. So we can get the information from that about these guys. So basically, in that idea, it's just asking you to select from the sys.foreignKeys table. The view is what that's asking you to do. So this is Mr. Kazuka. Are you? Oh, you doing okay? Can you not hear me?
Hello. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
I can now. Yes, sir.
Okay. So basically, this is what it's talking about. Byman, can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
Okay, cool. So really, it's just this easy. It's select everything from sys.foreignKeys. How many are there? You would select the count from sys.foreignKeys. Okay. I'm going to move on quickly now to next module. And the last module we have is kind of a theoretical module. Where is it? Okay, here we are. Selected topics in database design. I'm going to let you look at these guys on database design. I'm going to talk right now about normalization. We talk about the first normal form. And when we discuss the first normal form, 3 fundamental rules that you must have to be in the first normal form for data to be in the first normal form. Data are accessed by content only, never treated like spreadsheet, talk about row or column. There can be no duplicate rows, and all fields must contain a single value. All fields must contain a single value. For data to be in the first normal form. Example where it does not conform to this. Okay, we can talk about these guys. Invoice data that contain data with that contains repeating values. For example, this guy has an item description. Every time the item description changes, the vendor name changes. The vendor name is repeated again. So this is repeating values. So every time I have a different item description, I repeat it. So this would be like if I had an employee and an employee, a dependent of that employee or dependents. Every time that I had a different dependent, I would repeat all of the employee's information. It's very common, and if we have this repeating value, we are not in the first normal form. Again, we can have repeating columns. So if I have this guy, item description, so Zyka Design had card revision. Item descriptions are null. Why do I have null? Okay, 1, 2, and 3. So for example, in this one, invoice number, whatever that is, item description is a VB add, SQL add, library directory. So we have 3 items associated with this one. With Zyka Design, we have 2 items. And with this particular invoice, we only have 1 item. So we have lots of null values. The best example I can give of something that violates the first normal form is where we say all fields must contain a single value. And quite frequently we will see data that violate this. If I have a name in a field, so I have some person's name in the field, and the name is a composite name like John Doe. If I'm ever going to access those data and take out the first name and the last name as different values, then I am violating the first normal form. So a field has exactly 1 value means that the field is always used as the full person's name, John Doe. I never go in and pull out the last name or the first name out of that field. Now, this is violated quite frequently. But if it is, then we're violating the first normal form. For a table to a single value, okay, so when I add the invoice ID to that, invoice ID 1, 2, 3, 4, now I have something that, and the item description, even though the item description might repeat in there, so, or the vendor name might be repeated in there, I still have an invoice ID 1 talks about 1 single item description. Invoice ID 2 talks about 1 single item description. 3, 1 single item description. In this case, as up above, when I had a vendor name and an invoice number, I had multiple item descriptions. And so what I want to do is get it down to where there is just 1. So for each vendor ID, or excuse me, for each invoice number, what I want is each field containing exactly 1. So here is library directory, for example. I only want it to be library directory. I can never use it as library, and then go ahead and pull out the other one. Next. Second normal, so the first normal form, when I'm in the first normal form of data, that's kind of the best deal I can, the simplest I can get. It says that essentially that all data in the database, all rows, all columns in the database contain exactly 1 value. It says I will never go in and pull out pieces of it. So I cannot have a field in the database that contains a group of information separated by columns. So I can't have a field that contains 2 phone numbers, for example. Even though there's nothing stopping me from doing that, if I do that, I'm violating the first normal form. So it contains exactly 1 value. If you have a phone number, that phone number is the value of a column. If you have 2 phone numbers, then they have to be in 2 separate fields. You can't put them both in the same field. separated by a column, even though there is nothing that is stopping you from doing that. Okay. The second thing says that you cannot have any duplicate rows. So all rows are unique in some way. And the third piece of the first normal form says that data are accessed by content only. And you never go in and say, I want the third row or I want the fifth row. And the data are accessed by content only is violated when you talk about something like, give me the top 10%. The top 10% of a query is assuming that I want the ones that are ordered by, I want them ordered in there. So in a database, the rows are not ordered. Okay. So we have a way, we talk about the first normal form, we get the idea of the key. The key is what we get there. We talk about that data have to be, each row has to be unique. And there has to be something about that row that makes it unique. And there we get the idea of I need a social security number. I need some kind of a number, something that makes that row unique. It does not have to be one field, but it is far better if it is one field. So I'm looking for something like a social security number, your driver's license number. I want one field, preferably one field, that uniquely identifies exactly one or at most one row in the database. So with first normal form, we gain the idea of the key. Skipped over the first norm and second normal form. I thought there was something wrong with this guy. So first normal form is the key. There we go. Next is the second normal form. Second normal form says that I want the data, each row to depend on the whole key. So we should not have something that takes me to, let's see, in second normal form, we get the invoice ID. The second normal form, we get the idea of the foreign key, primary key, and that kind of thing. So I have invoice number, vendor name, invoice ID. And the invoice ID takes me to the invoice information. So I have invoice ID, invoice sequence, and the item information. My world, I wrote this some time ago. So basically the one row has to depend on the key. It has to depend on everything in the key. So I should not have something in this key that does not, for example, this one depends on the invoice number and the vendor name. So I should not allow it to depend on the invoice number and the vendor name. It can't depend on any smaller piece of it. So it depends on the key and the whole key. I want it to depend on the invoice number and all of the invoice numbers. So the invoice number is what takes me to this, and the invoice ID. So the invoice ID of 1, 2, or 3, that takes me to the other table with the foreign key relationship. So we have a key here, the invoice ID, that takes me to the vendor name and the invoice number. And then following that, I get the invoice ID takes me to the other information about the data. So it depends on the data, depends on the key and the whole key. So we don't want to have let's see, in the author's design, the invoice items table has to have a two-field primary key. I would prefer not to have a two-field primary key if I can avoid it. Sometimes there is no way around it, but what I have in that field should depend only on the whole key. So the key and the whole key, it should not depend on any part of the key. And in third normal form, when we apply to the third normal form, and we finally get down our data, by the way, are in the third normal form. And this takes us to the idea of we should not have anything in that uniquely identifies, by design, uniquely identifies one row in the table except the primary key. Now, we might have data such that it may be so that the vendor name is unique. That's just an accident. The vendor name happens to be unique, but there is nothing about the design of the tables that requires the vendor name to be unique. Let me take another example of that. Would we require you to have a unique password? Would I require that your password be unique in the set of people logging in? Okay, and this would be a real bad idea, because if I required you to have a unique password and I were to throw that password out because, hey, wait a minute, that password's already been used, I would be giving you information that somebody in the table in the system has that password, so it's a valid password. Now you know something that you shouldn't be allowed to know. Similarly, we don't want to require that the vendor name be unique as far as the database goes. The only thing that we care about is it is unique or not is the vendor ID. So you can have two vendors that have the same name, but they have to have a different vendor ID. So it cannot depend on having a unique vendor ID. And so the idea being that we don't have anything else that in the database design uniquely identifies one vendor or one invoice for that matter. So we get the idea then of what is the third normal form? Well, the first normal form, under the first normal form, we get the key. Under the second normal form, we get the idea of the whole key. And then third normal form takes us to the nothing but the key. And so we have this say, when we're in third normal form, we have the key, the whole key, and nothing but the key. And the person who posed this third normal form was a person known as Boyce Codd. He was an Australian writer back in the 60s. And so we say the key, the whole key, and nothing but the key. So help me, Codd, is kind of the joke. Let's look at this in terms of our tables. Now, when we have our tables as we have them set up, if I were to look into these guys, and I'm going to go to my Object Explorer, to the databases, and let's look under AP_DB, under the tables. And there is one here that I want to look at particularly, this is the invoice line items. So I'm going to look at invoice line items. And under the columns of invoice line items, let's look at the columns and let's look at the keys. I'm going to drop this guy, I guess. It says foreign keys. I guess you guys have seen this. Okay, and now I'm going to look at the top 200 rows of this table. I think that'll be all of them. I think there are, how many rows are in this guy? $118 rows. And let's look at what are the keys of this table. Can we do better than this? So how many keys? Look at our keys. We have the invoice ID and the invoice sequence number. What's my problem with my world here? I have two keys. I have a primary key that consists of two columns. I would rather not have this. Can I get away without that? I have another foreign key. If I look at it, the foreign key is the account number, and that takes me to the GL accounts. So the account number takes me to the GL accounts table, the global ledger accounts. But basically right now, let's just look at this foreign key. So the foreign key, the primary key of the invoice line items table is the invoice ID and the invoice sequence. Let's go look at the data. Okay, so notice that the invoice sequence number, invoice sequence, is essentially, it starts off with 1. So invoice ID 1, and the invoice sequence number is essentially 1 all the way through. Oh, wait a minute. Here's one right here. When we get down to invoice ID 12, invoice ID 12 has invoice sequence 1, invoice sequence 2, and 3, and 4. So there are 4 rows under the invoice ID 12 has 4 invoice line items. Let's go see what else we see. As we go down, we go back to there's only 1, there's only 1, there's only 1, there's only 1. Oh, wait, down here at invoice ID 78, we have 2 rows on that invoice sequence. So invoice ID 78 has 2 items on it. And we keep on going down there. And everything else just has 1 item. So all of these guys have 1 item with 2 exceptions of invoice ID 12 and invoice ID 78. And I could run a query against this table, and I could say, show me select invoice ID. Well, we can do that easily. New query, select. From where? Select invoice ID from invoice items, group by. Having. Greater than 1. In other words, I want to see anybody in here who has more than 1. I don't think I might have to go put a use in there. Let's see. I get two of them, invoice ID 12 and invoice ID 78. And those are the two we expected to find. There's 12 and 78 was the other one down there. Now, if I want to talk about one particular row in this table, what do I have to do? I have to specify the invoice ID, and I have to specify the invoice sequence number. Do they really depend on that? Do I really need the invoice ID and the invoice sequence number? Couldn't I do it better?
You could do
whether invoice ID, because the invoice sequence is the same.
I agree with you that I could just talk about the invoice ID, but the problem with it is that I have duplicate invoice ID 12s, for example. The invoice ID 12 is duplicated.
So wasn't that invoice ID the primary key?
Invoice ID is half of the primary key. The primary key of this table, as you will recall, is two fields. And I don't like that. I'll try to get away from having a two-field primary key, but it is the invoice ID and the invoice sequence number. And if you go over and look at the creation script, let's see. And if we were to invoice line items, if we were to look at the primary, so here's invoice line items, here's where it is created in the creation script. And by the way, this is important. Notice that down here, my constraint is the primary key, invoice line items PK, primary key, two fields. This is what I would like to avoid. In my design of the table, is there some way I can get around that? What is this? Oh, I'm in Notepad++. Go back to here. And can I get around this and be able still to represent my data? I think there is a way. I would look at this data differently, and I would look at the invoice sequence number. What if I made the invoice sequence number unique? What if I started out with the invoice sequence number of 1 and then incremented to 2? In other words, make it an identity. Don't have to make it an identity. I can get away without that. But let's say I did make it an identity, 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. And then I made the invoice sequence number the primary key all by itself. So I just start off counting, and each one is unique. So invoice ID 1, invoice sequence 1. ID 2 has an invoice sequence of 2. And they are all the same. And when I get to invoice ID 12, invoice sequence number would be 12. And then when I repeated that again, 12, the next one would be 13, the next one would be 14, the next one would be 15. And then I start again at 13, I would have 16, 17, 18, 19, and so on. So for each invoice sequence, for each one of these line items, the invoice sequence would be unique. And now I have gotten away from having two fields of the primary key. So if I specify an invoice sequence, I specify exactly one line item. If I say, show me the invoice sequences grouped by invoice ID, now I'm saying group by, so now I'm talking about this cluster of 4 of them here. So where I see where the invoice ID is 12, I would have 4 different invoice sequences. And it would be quite easy now for me to pull out the ones that had more than one and show me all of the invoice sequences that belong to invoice ID 12. Similarly, show me all of the invoice line items that belong to invoice 78. So it would be a fairly simple matter to put them together and keep them straight, because the mere fact that they don't always have, I don't like this idea of having a whole bunch of ones in here. I'm wasting a lot of space here with all of these 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1. I don't need that because if most of my invoice sequences are going to be 1, I really don't need it. What I need to do is I can carry all of my primary key information in the invoice sequence alone. Does that make sense? No?
The invoice ID 12, second 12 will be 13.
Just a minute. I bumped off my. Byman, say something for me.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm hearing you on my headset now. I was hearing you on the computer speaker. Does that make sense?
What I was saying, that if you do that, then the invoice ID 12 will have sequence number 12.
12. Another one would have 13, 14, 15. It doesn't have to have 12, 13, 14, 15. They just have to be different numbers over there in the invoice sequence, because in my world, that would become the primary key. Excuse me, the invoice sequence would become the primary key. I don't like seeing that duplicated invoice ID over there, and then the invoice sequence. So 12, 1, 12, 2, 12, 3, 12, 4, and then we get 13. But I'm seeing all of these ones in here. I would like to get away from that. I would like to just have one field be be my primary key if I had it. Now, somebody, Mr. Kasuka, you were going to say something?
Yes, what I was going to say was, why even have that duplicate role? I mean, why don't just have one, like you just explained, one primary?
One primary key is one field in the primary key is my goal. I won't always get that. There are times when I cannot do that. Trying to think of an example. The best example I have is I'm playing a game and I have 2 players. And in the game, so a player is unique in the player's table. But when I put them together, and I have a game now has 2 different players in it. Now, what is the primary key of that table? Well, it has to depend on both players. So both players have equal importance of it. You know, so if I talk about what is the primary key of a family unit? Well, in that one, it could just be one of them. But suppose that if, for example, in a game, the player named Kazuka could be involved, if that were a unique identifier. Actually, I would give you a number of some kind, a player ID, a user ID of some kind. You could be involved in many different games. So player ID Kasuka and player ID named Smith could be involved in a game. In that case, the primary key would be both Kasuka and Smith. And it would have to be that because both of them are of equal importance. So I can't always get a single entity, a single column as the primary key. In this case, I can. In the case of this guy, I can. So if the invoice sequence, if I put the invoice sequence as a identity, start with 1, 2, and 3, and 4, and 5, 6, and so on up, now I could very easily give you, show me all of this invoice sequences where the invoice ID is 12. So then I would have 12, 13, 14, 15 in there. And they would be the primary key, but I could group them all together very well by the invoice ID, where it was the same. That wouldn't be much trouble, and in fact, that should be done.
But again, I think that will not be necessary, because if Mr. Kazuka has one ID and the other player will have another ID.
Yes.
So it could be two different columns. They don't
Yes.
both do not have to be primary keys. One is the primary key and other is just a column single value. So you can say where this column, this value is the second ID.
I would tend to agree. However, either player may be involved in multiple games. So if I were talking about family units, and in at least the Western definition of marriage, and as most people see it, a person can only be involved in one marriage relationship, is the way we view that. And so it really doesn't matter which person's ID you use. It really doesn't matter, because it is a unique, the person involved there is exactly one. But when you talk about something like a game, the player ID 1 may be involved in multiple games. Player ID 27 may be involved in multiple games. The only game that is unique is the player 1, 27 has to return only one game. And at least that's the way that we do it. Could the same two players be involved in multiple games? And boy, that gets difficult. Go ahead.
Yeah, I get it now.
Because the idea is that what is unique about it. So if we make the invoice line item, the invoice sequence number be unique, and we force it to be unique, then we get the idea that I now have one primary key. And this this invoice ID might repeat. And it's okay if it does. I don't care if it does, because it's not the primary key. But I really don't like having a 2-column primary key. That really throws a hitch into my get along. Let me show you one other one that is a problem here in this database. Okay. Let's talk about the invoice total. What is the invoice total? Invoice total is money. Now I'm going to go back to the invoice line items here. What is the invoice line item amount? Well, let's go. Let me go back to the this. Go back and take a look at that. So we have the invoice line item amount. And so, for example, under invoice ID 1, we have an invoice sequence number of 1, and the invoice line item amount is what? $3,813.33. So if I were to go over here and look at under invoices, if I were to go look at the invoice ID 1, I would find the invoice total to be the same, $3,813.33. So tell me what the invoice total, based on what we're seeing here, for example, invoice ID 2 is $40.20. If I were to go over and look at the invoice, so from the invoice ID 2 has one column, has one row involved in that, and that's $40.20. What is then, how do I get the invoice total? Let's go look at the invoice total for number 12, for invoice ID 12. Invoice total for invoice ID 12 is $662. Where did I get that $662? Well, I would suggest that if I took these four guys right here, and added them up, $50 plus $75.60 plus $58.40 plus $478. If I added those four rows up, I should come up with $662. And I believe I do.
So was that group by invoice ID then?
Say again, please.
Was that group by invoice ID?
Yes, if I grouped by the invoice ID and took a sum, I would get them. So, for example, I could go look at that. So, select sum. What was that? Invoice line item amount. Let's see, let's select from invoice ID. And what would we call this? As
Invoice total.
invoice total from invoice line items. And because I have two of them, what do I have to do? I have to group by. And let me put a, I won't put a having on it. I could say having count greater than 1. If I were to run this, and I were to go down and look at 12, it would be $662, which is what I'm expecting. The rest of them are pretty straightforward, but $662, I'm expecting that to be the same as the payment total, or excuse me, the invoice total in the invoices table. We okay with that?
Okay, yeah.
And one in here that does not work. I have thrown one error in here. I don't remember what its number was now. Is it 114? I could write a query. What is it? How do I know, though, that it's going to be the same? What happens when somebody puts a different value into payment total? And I can modify this a little bit, select some from invoice line items, enter join. On okay, so I'm going to join it now with let's see, invoice ID. So this is coming from L. So this one ought to be okay, because now we'll see exactly the same thing. If I execute, I get exactly the same information. But let's talk about this, where invoice total does not equal the sum of the invoice line item amount. This is my problem child. So what if I have something in here that is not equal? Let's find that. Let's find him. No, it's got to go in the having. Yeah. Okay, so group by having, the invoice total does not equal the sum of the line item amount. And now let's see. Yeah, I can't do that, can I? Because I can't have invoice total. It's not there. I'm going to have to do an outer join here. Okay, so I have to have outer join. Well, I can show it right here. Now, if we look at it here,
We can create a view and show
we
you.
could create a view. Yes. I'm going to have to group by. Now it should work. I'll come back and talk about that. Okay. So I've got selecting the invoice ID. I should have put these two guys together, invoice total and invoice ID. So as I go down through here, I see that they are the same. Invoice totals are the same. I will come to one of them. See if I can find it. I think it's right down near the bottom. There's one of them in here, and I think that's what I do. I tell you to find it. Outer join would find it. There's one of them in here that is not the same. So what is making them be the same? Nothing. What is making sure that they stay the same? Nothing. So the idea being that in a database design, I do not want to have them be, I should have written this query to begin better. Invoice ID sum is invoice total. Anyway, one of them is not right. One of them isn't the same. So what is keeping me, what is making my invoice total reflect that? If I update the invoice line items, so if I change the invoice line item amount, if this invoice line item amount changes from $50 to say $100 or whatever, what is it that updates the invoices table? And the answer is nothing. So, for example, let me go ahead and change it. I'm changing it on number 12. If I change the invoice line items to 100, and I can do that just very easily right there. Now it has changed. So now if I go back to my query and I run my query again on that, if I execute my query, I know that number 12 put the invoice total back in there, and I'm going to run this query where and then go look at number 12. Notice that the invoice total from the sum, I should not have named them the same, but the one that I'm getting from the sum is on number 12 is now $712, but the one that I have in the invoices table still reflects $662. What's wrong with my world?
That's wrong. I mean, one.
Right.
It should be able to change because the tables are linked. Because I mean, if you go back to the basics of tables, if
yes,
they're linked, like in Excel, if you exchange one field, as far as when you click, as far as the tables are linked, when you change one figure, you should be able to change the other one.
But it didn't here.
It didn't here because the fact that the tables are linked does not guarantee anything about the data in the table. And even in an Excel table, it doesn't guarantee anything about the data. Just because two Excel tables are linked doesn't mean that if I change one column, it's going to change columns in the other table unless you set it up that way. So if I were to say it references something else, then that's fine. But what I have to do is I would get that field completely out of the invoices table, and I think somewhere I did that. So I don't know whether I've done it or not. I would have taken the I would remove from the invoices table, I would remove the entire invoice total field. I would take it out. Now, I would really leave it in there, but I would remove it. In other words, I wouldn't use it. I would just leave it there until I came along sometime and changed it. And so I would have call it invoices alt or invoices A or new invoices, and it would not have the invoice total in it. Then I would create a view that I would name invoices. And that view would have all of the fields of invoices, except invoice total, and invoice total. And so my view would be based on, if I were to create. Create view. And remember, anytime I'm creating a view, it has to have a go around it. Create view. This is my new. Select, I'll just do it this way, invoice. Invoice ID. Invoice line item amount. From invoices. Group by. Invoice ID. Okay, now what I would really do is I would put more fields in that. So I would name all of the fields from invoices except invoice total. What is wrong here? Invoice ID ambiguous. Okay, so it has to be I dot. Okay, now when I run this, if I execute this, it'll just say no column name, as this one would be. This one would be invoice total. And so I get it successfully completed. Now when I take a look at this, I can select everything from, what did I call this, new invoices? So from my view, when I select everything from the view, I would see, if I were to have it set up, it would have more fields in that. So I would have all of the fields from invoices in the select line from it. I would name them all, except there would be one that would not be in that, and that would be invoice total. Now, where does it get the invoice total? It sums the invoice line item amount. So you're seeing a view over here, and it looks like that's the invoice total. But if you change something in the invoice line items, it is automatically updated in the view. So that's how you would use a view to get around that. Okay, idea being that when you are setting up, I'll let you look at the rest of the things that we say there. We're about out of time tonight, and we're about out of time totally. I'm about to get everything graded, caught up, and I'll get everything reported to you. Hopefully by, make sure you have everything turned in.
Okay, that's the thing. If you go over the modules and see what all you are expecting from us.
What about the modules?
Yeah, if you go over the module listings, you know, like the modules we do from the.
Okay.
And see, go through this and say, this is what you're expected to turn in. This is what. So
well, they should appear in your Canvas. For example, I can look at Canvas.
Yeah.
And
because you said you talk about trigger, but there is a.
I talked about a trigger, but I did not give any kind of I did not give any specific assignment on a trigger. A trigger is actually part of the next class.
Oh, there is an assignment though.
In the assignment?
Yeah.
No, I didn't make an assignment on triggers. I'm certain of that. I made no assignments on triggers. If you look at the in the module on the views,
okay,
the views talk about a trigger. If you look at the module on views, where is that database design? Database views. Notice that the trigger comes after the assignment. So this guy of the trigger is just simply something that I talk about sometimes. A database trigger is a piece of code.
Oh, this is just a demonstration.
Yeah, it's a demonstration of these. I'm just inserting some information into it, And so if I go over here, I'm still inserting information into it, inserting into the table. Well, okay. Active vendors, so creating a view. So we have active vendors and non-active vendors as a view. Now here's a trigger. A trigger says that it's a delete vendor trigger. On vendors, instead of delete, I don't want you to delete, I want you just to update the field and set the active field, vendor active, to 0. In other words, you don't delete, the trigger takes over instead. So when you try to delete, the trigger executes instead of the delete. But I didn't assign triggers.
Okay, and on what we did today, there are 2 assignments here.
I am not going to make the assignment for today because we simply do not have time to do the assignment for today. So I'm not going to make that assignment. I have not put a due date on it. So anything that does not have a due date the quizzes don't have due dates because I don't feel like keeping track of them all. But any of the assignments that have due dates, so you can look through your things that are due. If it does not have a due date on it, then you're fine.
Okay.
If I have not put a due date, then it isn't there. So as I look at this, what do I have that's due? For example, I have 4 of them of Module 11 that I have not graded yet, and I can look into Module 11, and I can see that I have an assignment here from Byman that I need to grade. If I were to look further down into it, what else do I have? I have some stuff that people have turned in recently. For example, so there's the view assignment. Someone turned in a view assignment. Module 13 indexing assignment. I have 4 people that have turned in module indexing assignment. I have a practice test 2 that somebody turned in late. I'm not going to open it right now, but somebody turned in a practice test 2 late because I know it's late because I had them all graded.
That the view assignment is due, right?
View assignment should be due, yes. So if I look at the view assignment, August 8th, so Mr. Day has turned in the view assignment on August 8th. I don't have it from anyone else, but that's okay because I don't think I made that due until tomorrow.
So you don't need it.
Don't need it right now. I do need the view assignment.
Okay.
So it's fairly easy to do. I told you how to do the last one.
Yeah, but only number 2 is kind of difficult.
Well, number 2 is just good. Basically, look at creating a view as simply creating an SQL statement and wrapping a create view around it.
Okay.
One last question, sir, as we wrap up. Since we did not go over the exam 2 together, are you open to resubmissions? Say, for instance, if you had a light bulb moment, like, oh, I should have done this like this or whatever.
Yes. Look, yes, I'd be open. If you have a light bulb moment, go ahead and resubmit. You can resubmit by email, be fine. So if you had a light bulb moment, I'll be happy to look at your light bulb moment, sir. My job is getting you through the class.
Okay.
Light bulb moment and all. back to Byman's question, if it does if it does not appear in your to-do list, then you have all of the exercises turned in. Excuse me.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then look and see if you've got the quizzes done.
Okay.
Quizzes are pretty much busy work.
Everything is to be turned in by tomorrow, you say?
I need it in by tomorrow midnight because I have to do my grading.
Okay.
And that's just I can't run right up on the last day because I just have to have time to get everything sorted out and go through everything. So I at some point I've got to turn it off and say, okay, if stuff keeps trickling in, I never know when I'm finished.
Okay.
So after tomorrow night, I have to say, okay, everything is finished. Okay.
Okay.
Basically, look at your stuff that is due. If I have not put a due date on it, then it is not due. Well, okay, I want the quizzes. Go ahead and do the quizzes. I think I took one of them off, right? Which one was that? The
11.
number 11. I took that quiz off, so that's fine. You can skip that one.
Okay.
You should be able to.
Off the grading list.
Yeah, I'll take it off.
Okay.
And you should be able to figure it out since you have an unlimited number of tries at it, but it's not that hard. We didn't use some of that vocabulary that's in there. Okay.
Yeah, only the matter of time. I mean.
Well, yeah. I'm not too worried about the quizzes. I look at the quizzes, but the main thing I look at is the exercises and the tests.
Okay. Before tomorrow, when can we see our test 2 grade? I mean, based on that.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm gonna really try to get them all done. What I do is I download them all and then I go through them all question by question. So I grade all of question 1. So when I get finished, when I'm half done with them, half of the people don't have their grades back yet. So I'm about half done. Okay. Hopefully by tomorrow evening.
Okay.
Okay.
Because that will give us where we stand on an average grade. That tells me if I do not have time to do something, so I may be able to skip that.
Yeah. Okay. I'll hopefully I can get that stuff and communicate a standing to you. Take a look at it tomorrow evening, and I'll have a test 2 grade up for you.
Okay. Great.
Okay.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night. It's 21 minutes after 7. Okay. Good night, guys.
Good night.
Thank you, Dr. Smith. Do you teach any other languages other than SQL?
I teach at this time. I don't do that at Collin College. I am retired, which means I'm not teaching full time. So I stay pretty busy with SQL. I'm teaching an advanced SQL next semester. But all SQL next semester. Anyway, so
thank you so much, sir.
Yeah, I teach C and Java typically. Okay. Good night, all.
Where do you teach Java?
I don't teach it now, but I usually I do, but I'm not teaching full time any longer. So since I'm only teaching only at Collin College, and since I'm retired and don't feel like teaching full time, as a part-time teacher, I only teach 3 classes.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. All right.
All right. I'm gonna ending the recording.